Okay, so I did say that we are going to discuss some of the parts of the text that you choose, but I want to, before we do that, I want to give an overall assessment of the discussion. So sometimes just the fact that there's a discussion is wonderful, that people are talking, people are saying, and it just appears to be a good participation, and I'm happy. But then when I think about that later on, I always think about the people who were not talking, were not participating, and even those who are talking, how you are situating the discussion. So I just want to give a little bit of orientation today in terms of the text. Why are we reading Nietzsche? Nietzsche is, of course, a very important 19th century philosopher, and his take on the Greeks is really something that both synthesizes all the ways in which we read ancient Greek philosophers, but also subsequently how people read them. So for our purposes, it is an important sort of um, text in the interpretation of pre-Socratic philosophers. So it seems to be pretty clear, but I'm going to say it anyway, that he is setting up this opposition between Heraclitus and Parmenides. And you need to notice that and take a note of that and reflect on that. With Heraclitus, the philosopher of change, becoming, he uses the metaphor of fire. And for Nietzsche, this is a very significant split in the history of philosophy. Those philosophers who concentrate on what he called becoming, change that we observe with our sensations, etc., as opposed to philosophers of being, a metaphysical world, which he thinks that also influences Christianity immensely, and Christianity uh, invests all the value in existence into another world, into a metaphysical world, which is permanent and unchanging. And he seems to think that Parmenides is the one who initiated this way of thinking. So the value of the permanence over change, ice over fire. He uses Parmenides, like uses the metaphor of ice. He's very solid and has being in mind and values existence in terms of permanence. So that also is a way of explaining the logical thinking. So when Parmenides says, what is not, what is the only one that is, which seems like a lot of verbal sort of um, verbal explanation, but it's really this notion that something that is not permanent, something that is fleeting, hasn't really have any doesn't really have any value in terms of existence. So he says for Parmenides, I mean, his argument is a little bit complicated, of course. First, Parmenides sees these oppositions between cold and hot and, up and down and light and heavy, etc. But later on, he says, through a change in his understanding, he thinks that one of these oppositions is always privileged over the other, and the other doesn't have full existence. So he privileges being over becoming, weight over light, I suppose, or vice versa. I mean, doesn't really matter. The point is that he is setting up this opposition in terms of what is really being, and becoming is not significant. So what this does, of course, in the history of both philosophy, and also borrowed by theology, is to undermine the value of becoming, to undermine the value of this world, because we see this world as something changing, and something that changes and is in the process of transformation doesn't have any weight. And we can also see the traces of this in our understanding of knowledge, for example, knowledge being true and always true. For it to be reliable, it has to be permanent. It cannot be just for the time being and then change. We don't really trust the kind of knowledge that comes from things that might immediately change, because we search for that stability. And his claim is that this is a long-standing bias in the history of Western thinking, because it is from the Greeks, to privilege being over becoming. So that's the orientation. That's what I want you to frame this discussion when you are talking about Nietzsche's take on pre-Socratics. Even though he thinks that Parmenides is one of the monolithic thinkers and he's very important, he seems to privilege Nietzsche, Heraclitus over Parmenides because he's the philosopher of becoming. So is this point clear? Is that what you got from the text? And is that as a general orientation helpful in approaching the text, but also in terms of your writing? Because tragedy is somehow connected with change, so with becoming. So therefore he talks about Heraclitus as being melancholic because there's something saddening and somehow melancholic about change. And that's the passage of time. And, you know, I always say, I mean, I don't mean it seriously, but maybe in terms of experience, you can understand it a little bit better when you become aware of the fact that your possibilities are actually now less than your actualities. So, you know, you are looking into the future, although in 2020, I'm not really sure, but you have this kind of set of possibilities in life, what the future is going to bring, etc. At some point in your life, it's going to be, okay, I've done more than I will ever do. And, you know, the past is, for me, in terms of my lifespan, is much greater than the future. And that's a kind of recognition of the passage of time, the sort of generational conflict, and the way in which power plays into that, and all of that. So just think about it in terms of a rhythm of life. And I think that's what Nietzsche ultimately forces us, or invites us to think in terms of how do we read these philosophers in terms of life, because Nietzsche is a philosopher of life and he sees philosophy as a way of life more than just a set of propositions or knowledge or something. Okay, that's the little bit at the beginning. Any questions about this? Anything you want to clarify before we go on? So who suspects that I'm going to call on them? Anybody else? Yeah, Cameron, I'll come to you maybe a little bit later, but yeah, David and Caitlin. So maybe you were kind of a little bit aware of this. Do you want to share anything with us? Any section of the book you want to discuss? Well,
yes,
you better do. Yes.
It's on page 78. It's in the middle of the first full paragraph. It says, "It is immobile, for where could it move to? It can be neither infinitely large nor infinitely small, for it is perfect, and a perfectly given infinity is a contradiction. Thus it hovers, bounded, finished, immobile, everywhere in balance, equally perfect at each point, like a globe, though not in space, for this space would be a second existing. But there cannot be several existents, for in order to separate them, there would have to be something which is not existent, a supposition which it cancels itself. Thus, there is only eternal unity." And then it goes on to say on to page 79, halfway through the first paragraph again, it says, "Whatever you do, do not be guided by your dull eyes, nor by your resounding ears, nor by your tongue." So this interested me because they talk about how you have to separate the spirit from the body, and
Who's that? Who's
well,
that?
I think it was Parmenides.
Parmenides, yes.
Parmenides talks about how you have to separate the interpretations from your body, which would be your dull eyes and your resounding ears, from your thinking alone, which I assumed was your spirit. And these two, even though they are acting in eternal unity, you still have to separate your interpretations from your body as well as your thinking, which is your spirit.
Okay, how would you situate this with respect to what I just said in terms of Nietzsche's take on Parmenides?
Well, you did kind of introduce the permanence, which permanence in this, this is only assuming that for the permanence would be your spirit, because the spirit is unchanging, unaltered. This is the permanence, which is our soul, our thinking alone. And your body is able to be changed, altered, because mortality would be the changing or the altering of our body.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is almost for us now common sense in the sense that, you know, you too, I suppose, but mostly when you get older again, you observe certain changes in your body in a way that more easily identifiable, and therefore you don't want to identify with that. You say like, that's not me. Me is something more permanent, unchanging, deep in my soul, in my personality. Psychologists make up a lot of words for that, but you know, they sort of try to come up with like, what is it that determines who you are in a way that you don't believe that your body is. Now, of course, this may this may be problematic for a lot of people who have, you know, everybody has a relationship with their bodies, but sometimes you find your identity very much tied in to that concept of the body. But for the most part, even, you know, when you are sort of having this notion that my body doesn't fit my identity, that sort of assumes a kind of identity that is deeper in your being than the physical appearances of the body. So, but Nietzsche, just because he says these things from the mouth of Parmenides, doesn't mean he subscribes to them. So these are not Nietzsche's ideas as he proposes as the truth. It is his characterization of Parmenides, as you rightly identified. Yes. Any questions, comments about this? Any thoughts? Why in philosophy it has been the permanence that is privileged over change? Yes, Kate, please go ahead.
I mean, I think it's just human nature to want to privilege things that we feel are tangible and that we can hold and that kind of solidify our own position in the universe. I mean, if you notice that your own body is dying and that if you have some physical idea that you can hold on to and say like, well, look, this is staying the same. Maybe I can, by like property of just being near it, like take that kind of permanence, apply it to my own existence. One thing I was going to say was I thought this passage stood in really sharp contrast to the Heraclitus fragment. I think it was 62. Yeah, all that can be seen, heard, and experienced. These are what I prefer. Like, I don't know. When we were doing the first read through of the passage, I just kept pulling back to that one in contrast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just I want to invite you to think about why you said this is human nature.
I think I said it's human nature because I think the vast majority of us do it. I think because most of us do it. I don't want to overgeneralize and say that all of us do it, but near all of us do it. And maybe we can move past a point where we do it, but I think we all start from that kind of grasping.
Is it okay? So I'm just gonna provoke you a little bit. Is it possible that this actually, in and of itself, a Greek cultural bias? This is something we in the West think about permanence as privileged. And could it be that this is what comes to us from the Greeks, particular strand of the Greeks, and we hold on to that through long generation of Christianity and cultural ways of thinking of privileging permanence over change. We need to leave our mark in the world. We need to be known. We need to leave something behind. That's why we have people giving money to institutions and naming rooms after them as if that's going to make any difference for their lives. So that could that be something much more actually cultural than and historical than something that is in our nature.
I think 100% it could be. I mean, I'm a Western woman who's been raised in purely Western institutions. And I think that you're probably right on calling me out that there's a good chance that I'm just projecting like cultural values onto the human soul.
I'm not calling you out. This is not a calling out thing. So this is just the way in which we think sometimes about, we all do, about certain things that actually, I mean, it goes, you're absolutely right, for centuries that people privilege that, then you start thinking that this must be what human beings are. And that's absolutely normal. So I'm not like calling you out. I don't like that word. So.
Okay. But yeah, I think that's a valid
question, not a sort of dogmatic statement, but it's worth thinking about how much of our natural thinking is actually culturally determined. Yes, Josue.
Yeah, I was thinking about where he talks about A is A.
What?
The
What?
tautology in page 77. In terms of this permanence, I don't know if it has something to do with that, because he seems to be calling it, well, he seems to be calling it an insanity, but I think it has to do a lot with like Greek syllogisms and like in terms of Parmenides, right? So things are because they are kind of thing. So they're, I don't know if it has to do with this tradition of logic, right?
Absolutely.
Which, yeah, seems to be the case in Parmenides, right? But then I think Nietzsche's also talking about A not being A, right?
Well, yes, when he was, remember when he was talking about Heraclitus, and he said Aristotle actually thought that Heraclitus was undermining the basic principle of logic, principle of identity, principle of non-contradiction. So this is on page 52, when he says, everything forever has its opposite along with it. This is what goes along what Kate said in terms of change that we are observing. And in such unabashed fashion that Aristotle accused him of the highest crime before the tribunal of reason, to have sinned against the law of contradiction. So on page 77, the one who is on the side of law of contradiction is Parmenides. A is A cannot be not A. Parmenides seems to be saying that A is not A. I mean, sorry. Heraclitus seems to be saying A is not A, therefore violating the principle of contradiction. I mean, principle of contradiction actually is a principle of non-contradiction. A should be A should not be not A. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know whether you took logic, but doesn't matter. You all think that what contradiction is, and we don't think properly if what we think contradicts itself. So when I say like, I'm hungry, I'm not hungry, or I love you, I hate you, that seems to be like, well, you can say it, but it requires a different kind of approach. You shouldn't say it. Okay, Blessed, go ahead.
I just wanted like to go back to something you said. I think I'm a little bit confused. Like I agreed with what Kate said in terms of how it's human nature to want to attach permanence. Like
We
Sorry.
we question whether something, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's what what I wanted to say was that, like, I feel like it manifests itself cross-culturally, unless like just like in different forms, like how the concept of an afterlife, or like there being more than just like this, because like I feel like as humans we're just naturally afraid of death as being the ultimate and the final and everything like that. So like that's basically what I wanted to say. Like, so does that, because like it does manifest itself cross culturally, the idea that like there's something more. So I felt like that could mean it's human nature.
That's a good observation, and to a certain extent, I agree with you. But whenever we talk about cross-cultural in the 21st century, I find that slightly problematic because it treats culture independently of their history and interaction over over a number of centuries, which also includes colonialism, imperialism, etc. So we treat, like when we talk about like sometimes in anthropology, but also in like politics, etc., as if these cultures sort of mushroomed into the world separately in different places, and they are not formed in relation to each other. And we don't look at the history, we don't understand that history, we don't like understand how they interacted and shaped each other. So just because something is cross-cultural doesn't mean that it is universal. It might be more common than which actually is. So like capitalism is still a distinctly European invention in its current form, but it is exercised everywhere in the world to a certain extent. Doesn't make capitalism universal, it just makes Europe imperialist. That seems to be more of a accurate understanding of what actually happened over the years. And you can say like, oh, look at these formerly colonized people, they are capitalist too, hence capitalism is great. It's like, yeah, because they became capitalist because you situated them somewhere in the world order, whatever. So this is a plug for the post-colonial theory next semester, which analyzes these questions. But also, that's why I want to say, like, yes, it might still be culturally specific, even though it might be cross-cultural. So that's the sort of complicating of that assumption that a lot of Western scholars make today, namely, if something is cross-cultural, then it must be human nature, or a lot of other people think in the same way, but they think it because you really colonize their minds to a certain extent too. So that's why studying ancient Greek philosophy is, well, I mean, it's not pre-colonialism because Greek already had some colonies, but it's a different way of understanding the emergence of thought without necessarily believing it to be universal. So that was my point. Any other? So I'm actually teaching you a little bit post-colonial theory in ancient Greek philosophy, but that's cool. Yes.
I think the only thing, I don't know, I've been sitting here thinking about if there's any way that you could make a universal argument for why we prefer physical evidence over that which is intangible. And I hate to say this, but I think you have to pull it back to science to do that. Like, I mean, there is the fact that when we are all born, we are instantly needing to seek resources like throughout our entire lives. And those resources have to be physical. We can't survive on ideas themselves alone. So in that, we have some attachment to finding things that we can hold, that we can look at, that we observe, that we can consume. And in that sense, all humans are driven towards finding physical things or things that they can like actually conceptualize directly before them or experience in some way, which is why like intangible evidence, because it doesn't give any type of gratification or relief to the physical body, maybe more to like the soul, if you want to call it that.
But under that argument, I would imagine like we would privilege becoming our being. because we need the resources. It is the body, it is the situatedness physically in the world. So that would be a much more Heraclitean perspective, and privileging that over Parmenides, who seems, Nietzsche at least seems to think, is abstract. He talks about ideas. He talks about pure thought and law of contradiction, or etc., but not what actually happens in front of us physically and what we can learn empirically. Don't you think?
I don't know. I think in some ways Heraclitus is a lot more abstract, but that's my reading on it. I think that kind of there's a level of consciousness that comes into these arguments where, yeah, I think most people are actually privileging being, like, becoming, but they don't have the ability to realize that they aren't just being. Like, so many of us are just so grounded in the moment that like it's like I am constantly in a state of being. I cannot envision, because I am still fighting for my survival. I do not acknowledge that I am on this long process of becoming. So in that way, like, are we really marking becoming
Oh,
being is versus awareness or actual process? I
okay.
think
Maybe maybe we are a little unclear about the distinction between being and becoming. So being is really the permanent, stable, unchanging. Being is, according to Parmenides, that which conforms the principle of non-contradiction. Becoming is more like what you describe as my immediate needs, my immediate changes.
Mhm.
So becoming is not something like the future or something like that. In fact, being is the future, namely in this world, under many religious perspectives, this is a transitory world for a full being of God and being permanently, eternally somewhere.
Mhm.
So yeah, we should be careful about, like, because the words being and becoming are maybe not as accurate as change versus permanence, for example. And our body changes, our needs changes, our sort of relationship to the world changes. But even in science, when we want to formulate ideas, theories, we are searching for permanence, at least permanence beyond the immediate, so the immediate changes. So science wants to say, this is how it's going to happen. There is a regularity in the world. There are laws. They are always going to, which presumes, even as concretely as within the reproducibility of experiments, even our idea of evidence is just, it can't be evidence once. It has to be reproduced. It has to be the same again, so that we trust that. You can't just sort of say, okay, swallow this pill and you are going to be fine. And you go like, wait a second, how many people swallowed this? What is the control group? What is the placebo effect? I'm not going to swallow it. So that's the permanence that we are searching for in our discourses, or even life. Like, I say, like, I'm not going to get the COVID shot right away, right? Will you? Well, you shouldn't. Unless you really need it right away, you should be like cautious, like let's see how many people are going to survive this thing. So, and you need the reproducibility of the results, right? Or am I making a leap? I don't know how you.
Supposedly that's what they're doing right now. It's testing it on thousands of people.
People who are not fortunate enough to make that decision, probably, of saying no to it. So, I don't know who they are testing to. I have like really sort of sinister thoughts about, like, who are they testing this on in some other parts of the world, people who are like not even capable of saying no, so that people in the first world can live. So I don't know. I don't know, so I can't speculate, but animals probably, although, yeah, anyway, whatever. We are not talking about COVID. So. Okay, any other additions to this discussion or any other questions? Anybody wants to take us to a different direction? Caitlin?
The passage that I thought was interesting was kind of similar to David's. It's on page 81 in the middle of the first paragraph, where he says, no, the strange thing about his philosophic feat at this period is just its lack of fragrance of color, soul, and form, its total lack of blood, religiosity, and ethical warmth. And then at the end where he says, take away everything that comes to be, everything lush, colorful, blossoming, illusory, everything that charms and is alive. Take all these for yourselves and grant me but the one and only poor, empty certainty.
Yeah.
I just thought it was kind of interesting how he describes it, and it just seems very like empty and sad.
That's an excellent point. Yes. Again, he is sort of verbalizing that notion of Parmenides, and he seems to go against that, right? He says what Parmenides is saying is makes it like empty, poor certainty. Is that how you read it?
Yeah.
Okay. See, this is what I hear when you ask questions that start with confusion. So when you say like, I'm confused, I'm very happy, but I also give you like a logical and certain answer to make you not feel confused. But that's a Parmenidean world, because I want you to continue to be confused with the question, not and enjoy it. But it seems like even intellectually, we don't want multiplicity. We don't want change. What is confusion? You have one idea and then you have the opposite, and it changes, and then you cannot hold on to it. You cannot be stable. You cannot find permanence. And therefore, that's what we need to promise you. That's what we are doing always, giving you an answer. So rather than giving a solid answer, all you can do in the moment of confusion is to give an orientation. It's like, okay, move this way. That doesn't mean it is certain, but that orientation is perhaps all Heraclitus can provide. But Parmenides wants to say, okay, here is the solid answer. A is A. So as long as A is A, we are going to be stable. And that goes back to what Kate said, like, we understand our nature as seeking clarity, seeking certainty, seeking, you want to be certain of your answers. And that's your lifestyle. I mean, not your personal lifestyle, but that's the lifestyle. Like, we want to make correct judgments. We make those judgments certainly, and we need to feel good about ourselves by making those judgments. And usually we judge other people, of course, but that's our attitude. Yes, Olivia.
So I wanted to get people's thoughts on a confusion that I'm having with this section, because what I think I've heard, especially like David, I think said this, and I apologize if I'm misinterpreting you, David, but like, there's this idea that like there's the world of perception, which Parmenides sees as sort of a world of illusion, and then there's this like eternal world of the existent, and there's this kind of idea that like if you sort of look within yourself and look within your soul, you can kind of gain access to the world of permanent existence away from the illusory world of perception. But that feels like there feels like a sort of, yeah, there's a religious and spiritual content to that idea, which is, I feel, in contrast to this section that Caitlin just pointed out, where Nietzsche talks about Parmenides' philosophy's lack of blood, religiosity, ethical warmth, things like this. So I guess my question, I know I've kind of rambled on, is about like, at least in Nietzsche's interpretation, does Parmenides think that you can access the world, the permanent existent world, or are humans totally screwed in that regard? Like, can we only have the world of illusions?
So you want to hear other people's thoughts. So
I consider you part of the class. You can
thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm not fully clear on the question. I'm sorry, but could you maybe try to just restate it for me?
Can somebody else restate the question, since you are listening to each other? Just the question, not the answer.
You asked if people could access the permanence, right?
Illusion, right?
Well, like what I was thinking was, like in Parmenides' interpretation, like the illusions are definitely like what we can see and interface with, but like yeah, like Jared said, like can we also access the permanent world of the existent?
I think that lots of people would say that it's through reason we can access the permanent world, because that's something universal and something that can't change.
But then the question is, why is this not religious? I think you brought up that idea too. Then when Nietzsche says it is not the religiosity on page 81. Was that part of your question, Olivia?
Yeah, like I feel like the idea of being able to access like an eternal truth about the universe through reason or through your soul or spirit, like that feels like a very like a religious thing and not necessarily a bloodless thing, in in the metaphorical sense, I guess. But then Nietzsche is very insistent that this is not a philosophy containing blood or religiosity or anything like that.
The way I understand it is just that like turning off your senses, I guess, is a tool that can be used both by religion, but also by like philosophy and going down this intuitive path. And I think honestly, the next part of the reading will go into more about Parmenides' specific like theories after turning away from sensory perception.
Like kind of on like page 79, where Nietzsche they talk about how Parmenides kind of in the middle is like, nor by your resounding ears, nor by your tongue, but test all things with the power of your thinking alone. And I think basically I guess what he's trying to imply, well, not imply, kind of just state, is that the only way to kind of understand, I guess, these universal truths or truth, this kind of sense of permanence is through thinking. But I kind of feel like by thinking, we're still kind of creating our own beliefs and our own understanding of what truth is, which could also be, an illusion, just like how our body senses kind of, give out this false comprehension of the world. So I feel like Parmenides, well, himself is, what he believes in fairly problematic as well.
Yeah, I agree with what Jack said, but like to an extent, I feel like what Parmenides is saying is that more like if you engage in the type of thinking that he's like talking about, like the only outcome then becomes the universal. Like if you do it correctly, basically. Like, it's not necessarily about how we have different interpretations and like how we act differently or whatever. Like, I feel like it's more about like just if we undergo the process of thinking and like pursuit of like, for example, like wisdom or whatever, then like the outcome then becomes the permanence, like ignoring your sensory perceptions.
So is it just each person has their own understanding of what permanence is, instead of having what we were talking about earlier, a universal kind of truth or like something like that? But if it's our own comprehension, our own idea of permanence, then it's not universal, and I don't think it's permanent.
What I imagine Parmenides would say about that is like that if you're using your reason to try and reach some universal truth, everyone's going to kind of land on the same universal truth because it is the actual eternal existence. Even though, you know, from experience, I would probably disagree with that because, like you say, everyone has their own interpretation of, the universe.
And I think the issue with that is the answers you arrive at are only the most general answers you could possibly come up with. Like on page 80, it says, henceforth, truth shall live only in the palest, most abstracted generalities, in the empty husks of the most indefinite terms, as though in a house of cobwebs. So, yeah.
Well, can I make this discussion a little bit more concrete, like in terms of one question? So we are all thinking, looking at evidence and, well, some of us, and trying to come up with the idea of there's a climate change. My favorite topic. So there's a climate change. So the henceforth truth shall live only in the palest and most abstractest generalities, which means what's the most abstract generality? There's a climate change. Does anybody disagree with that? Nobody does. Do they? I mean, even the most, so to speak, conservative, drill people, etc., acknowledge that, yes, there is a climate change. Now, the debate or the fight seems to be about why. Why is this happening? And if everybody have their interpretation, then what is the status of a scientific study of climate change and its causes, as opposed to somebody bringing a snowball to the parliament? That's my interpretation. Snowball. So are we going to say, sure, that's your interpretation. It's as valid as everybody else's. We have a democracy. You have one vote. I'm just trying to convince other people to not believe in the snowball and vote differently. But ultimately, the truth is going to be won by fighting opinions. There is no truth in and of itself. Is that it? I mean, please don't say yes. That will make me depressed. But I mean, if you think that it's yes, say yes. But that to me appears to be a cynical approach. Like, you know, somebody who is bringing snowball to a meeting is as valid in their perspective as anybody else.
So, are you saying that, like, Parmenides would have that opinion because in his view, each of those little opinions are like, climate change is caused by humans, or look at the snowball, it's okay, or whatever, like, those are all equally illusions, and the only actual truth is just like there is climate change?
Well, Parmenides says that there is an actual truth. There is a truth, regardless of what other people in their individual ways might think. That's Parmenides' point. Now, of course, climate change is just an example, and it's not a good example because it's an empirical fact. But in terms of reason being like the ability to think and coming up with the logical truths for Parmenides, it is one, regardless as to whether individually people believe it or not. They have not traveled this, they haven't taken this journey. That's why we talk about education. Like, why do we even educate people? I mean, if everybody's opinion is as valid as, like, why do you even go to school? Isaac, you had something to say. Oh, David, I'm sorry, first David, yeah.
So according to Parmenides, are you able to, he talks about thinking alone, which would be your sentience or your perceptions. So would you be able to connect these to the concepts of universal oneness and the self and awareness?
Well, actually, ironically, your ability to think alone is the one that connects you to the universal. You are not simply thinking about your immediate perceptions, you are thinking of a universal truth. Therefore, this idea that even if everybody in the world thinks differently, I'm still right. And ironically, we at least present people like Pasteur or Galileo or Copernicus as these kind of people. They don't listen to the majority of opinion or the accepted truth, etc. They insist on their way of discovering the truth. So there's this solitary scientist myth that we have, like what you need to believe, and ultimately, of course, you need to be redeemed at the end and you need to be right. I'm sure there are a lot of people who thought differently than other people and then put into mental asylum. So that's the dilemma.
Right. And he talks about how it is immobile and it hovers, which would this make it static rather than permanent?
I think they go together.
Or they're hand in hand, right? Yeah. This gave me an existential crisis.
This Parmenides gave you an existential crisis.
Well, him and Heraclitus, because Heraclitus, I think he mentions how everything flows and you're not able to step into the same river twice.
Yeah.
Because the next time you step into it, it changes. But then even if you step into the river one time, it changes the moment that you step in it.
Mm-hmm.
Before you had even stepped in it, it changed. That makes more sense to me.
It always makes me a little nervous, but yeah.
No, well, it's making me nervous. Because the moment between you stepping into the river, it had already changed, which means that it changed before you had even stepped into it. So you weren't able to perceive what was in the river before you had stepped into it. I'm making some sense here. I'm confusing myself though.
Well, that's true, but it's not Heraclitus who is making you have an existential crisis. You just had an existential crisis. You just thought that Heraclitus simply verbalized that, because nobody can give you an existential crisis unless what they are talking about is something that you understand and, independently of Heraclitus, no. So people say like, oh, philosophy is making me this or that. And I always say, philosophy is not doing anything. It's just indicating things that already are problems. It's not like he's inventing a problem.
No. It's more of I gave myself the crisis.
Okay, good. That's good.
Right.
I think there's something to be said about that in terms of tragic. I think, well, at least for the paper, that it's certainly kind of like the certainty that we trust and that we attach to is broken, right? Like COVID and everything that we believed in it just kind of disappeared, you know? I mean, I was at school and I was at Heirloom, and then COVID happened, and just kind of like, now I'm at home, you know?
That's your existential crisis. Okay.
Or like the economy, just when it happened, just kind of plummet. I don't know. So like we attach to the different certainties, like in a Parmenidean way, and then we come to realize that it's not the case with Heraclitus.
Well, exactly. So kind of like the irony is that this is the time you don't want to hear about Heraclitus, because you say like, oh, shut up. We already know, we already are experiencing this. Give me some Parmenides, because I really need to be so existentially. But if you are stuck in a job for 40 years and your life is rotting, etc., you go like, okay, give me some Heraclitus, because this is what I need. So Nietzsche recognizes that kind of rhythm in life. So we are not saying like Heraclitus is right and Parmenides is wrong, or vice versa, but in terms of living, that is a process. And none of them is absolutely correct, and you can't be absolutely correct. And that's why part of philosophy being tragic is you'll always be confused. You'll always be confused. You'll never be like, you might not even be certain when you die. So
I don't think any person just starting their 10th hour of like a mandatory overtime shift would be comforted by someone being like, oh, don't worry, it's not even the same job that it was a moment ago. It's okay. Like invoking Heraclitus. I don't think that would do a lot for them.
absolutely it would. Why do you think so?
I think that the tiredness that you feel would kind of override any philosophical comfort that you would take there.
I don't know, philosophical comfort. I don't know whether it will comfort you, but if you could also convince those people that what you are doing in 10 hours is actually not your own doing, that might be different. I don't know. I don't know.
That's a good point.
I always have issues with this, like philosophy is for rich people or something, or it is a privilege or something like that. Which
That's
kind
not,
of,
I'm sorry, that's not what it was.
no, I know. I
Say.
understand what you meant. And I do too. Like sometimes it's like, you go like, oh, I hate philosophy. What the hell are we talking about? And then I realize even that is a philosophical attitude. So that's my dilemma. So anyway, Charlie.
Something that I'm grappling with in my head a little bit is, don't both of these views kind of they do their like kind of have prerequisites in that you have to have adequate like experiential awareness of the world around you, and so that, because if you're not comfortable in your like sensory existence, then you're not going to ponder I'll call it like a higher level thought of, is this all permanent? Is it all impermanent? So doesn't it necessitate kind of some threshold of like sensory existence? Because just thinking about something else that I'm reading right now is like, your brain is just like, it's in a dark box, and the only thing that it receives different data stimuli from different points on this vessel surrounding it. And so you have to kind of have, I feel like you have to have some threshold of information from those different sources before you can kind of make interpretations based off of it. And so isn't there privilege inherently involved in that you have to reach a point of existence, step back, and be able to be like, okay, so I exist here. Now, what does this mean?
Well, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that there is no privilege in philosophy. I think, of course, I consider even the possibility of asking philosophical questions a privilege for myself, but not an economic privilege, not a kind of oppressive privilege of other people. It's a different kind of privilege. And I want to read, well, actually, let me read this after the break because it requires its own contemplation. This is earlier in the text, which we may or may not have covered, but hopefully it will answer your question a little bit in an indirect way. So let's go crazy and take 9 minutes and meet at 10:10.